today. Uh, I know in Japan they actually have living treasures. They will find a person who's superb at a particular kind of craft or activity, and they will make him a national treasure. Well, we have a national treasure of Kenya because when Don and Faye Smith, they came back to the United States after being in Africa for many, many, many years. Daystar University, which they had founded, asked them to come back and die there. They wanted to bury them in Kenya, which is a way of saying, you are one of our treasures. So it's a great honor to introduce Don and Faye. They have been sponsored by this church since 1959. We have sponsored them for that long. Now, that doesn't mean that they've been doing the same thing the whole time. They've started a publishing company. They started Daystar University. They started Worldview Institute. He's taught at Western Seminary. He's published. He's gone around the world. He's still in demand as a speaker because his specialty is intercultural communications, and he has so many years of experience in working in so many different cultures that he is a treasure. So I'd like to introduce a hometown boy. He was from Taft. I'd like to introduce Don Smith. Don?
Yes, got it. Thank you. My wife and I have been looking forward very, very much to being with you. And first of all, my wife was unable to travel today. One reason we came at this time for 3 months, 2 months in Oregon, 1 month with our son on the East Coast, as because her health was declining, and our doctors in Kenya, in Nairobi, very good doctors, said they wanted a second opinion. So we came and we've received that, and they gave her medication, but the medication knocked her out for 10 days, literally. She hardly woke up in the 10 days, and I think she ate half an apple during that period and drank a bit of water. And so that ended last Friday, and yesterday morning was the first time she woke up by herself and got dressed and came out. But even there's a very interesting connection to this church. Bill and Shirley Portis, who were the first full-time pastors here, were friends of ours for many years gone back. In fact, Jim and Marilee Sauter, who first began the work commuting from Portland, and Bill and Shirley and Faye and I were in the same college class at First Baptist Church in Eugene. And now we've scattered all around the world. Warren Webster and Shirley were also in that class. So we had, out of the some 100 and 110 in that college group near the university, 80 have been in missions full-time or for extended periods. So we can see that we come with a lot of good blessing from our colleagues. Now, my wife is unable to travel, as you can understand, but I couldn't leave her. And up until Thursday night, I thought, how am I going to do this? I needed and wanted to be with you, and yet I didn't want to leave my wife. Shirley Portis came by and said that she would stay with Faye and until I came back home. And so she came yesterday. We got her settled, and then I came here. But when I went out to start the car that we had been loaned to use for 2 months, it wouldn't start. The battery was okay, everything was all right, the motor turned over, but it wouldn't catch. So immediately Shirley said, take my car. So the car that I'm driving is from the man who was the first pastor of this church. And so the connections go back all the way. And that illustrates the greatness of the family of God. Warren and Shirley served in Pakistan, and the Laveleys served in Nigeria from that class. And Bill and Shirley served from here to Italy, and we've served our life in Africa primarily, but even from Africa, the ministry has extended in many parts of the world. I don't intend to preach to you today. I enjoy the privilege of preaching the Word of God and teaching the Word. But I wanted to share with you today what you as a church have made possible, what you've been partners with us over these 60, well, we've been in Africa most of the time since 1952. And I'd like you to know and understand what you have been part of, even if you weren't there. You have prayed for us, you have supported us, and you have made a real difference in our lives. As Pam indicated, I spent most of my boyhood at Taft on the Siletz Bay. My father was vice principal of the high school and the coach of everything, all sports. And I think when he was the coach there in his second year was the first time in known history that Taft beat Newport in football and basketball. And many interesting occasions I remember. I remember being fascinated with football as a boy, but I couldn't understand how people could enjoy playing in the mud, because that's all Taft High School had in those years was a mud bowl. But they played. I did play football later. When my father was finished there, he worked in the shipyards as an electrician during the World War II for a short time, and then we moved to La Grande, where I finished high school. And there our football team went undefeated until the state finals, and then we lost to Medford by 1 touchdown. And so we had a great time, and some of those teammates have still been friends. Most of them have gone to be with the Lord already, but even our leading player, quarterback, came to know the Lord through the team members who witnessed to him over the years. The family of God is everywhere, and I want you to share a little bit through slides and through what I can say of what you have done with us in Africa specifically. And we did touch on other parts of the world as well. But one psalm, just part of it, that gives a very strong statement of why this is important. May God be gracious to us and bless us. Of course we want that. Maybe our hands are out to receive the blessing, but listen to the rest of it. And make his face shine upon us. You know, I realized what that means when I stayed for a time with some desert nomads in northern Kenya. And they would take fat from a sacrificial lamb that they would use at a feast. And then they'd take that fat and rub it all over their face and their body, because it stopped the loss of moisture in a desert climate where the temperature was like 120 during the day. At night it was quite a bit cooler. It got down to 90. And so people would build a fire and gather around it to get warm at night. But without that fat, they would have died from dehydration. There was no water. It would rain in that area once every 7 or 8 years. And they would dig up to 100 feet down through a sandy riverbed to get to water to survive. So that to have that shining face was a symbol of life and health. And that's exactly the image that's here. Because remember that the people in Israel in the old days were lots of times in a semi-arid or arid area. And make his face shine upon us, that your ways may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. May the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you rule the peoples justly and guide the nations of the earth. I won't read the rest of Psalm 67, but that describes the glorious privilege of being one who was able to talk to people who did not know of the Almighty God. They knew there was a God, but they didn't know the way to him. And to be able to have that privilege is what I wanted to share with you a bit this morning. A little bit of background to our family. And as I said, I'm not intending to preach to you. I just want to share with you what you, working with us, has caused to happen in Africa. How did a boy from Taft who refused to follow the Lord as a young lad, and only when I became a Christian through Christian friends at high school in Beaverton did I begin to follow the Lord. And then since he called us to mission, my wife when she was about 10, myself when I was a freshman in university at Westmont College. And God called us to mission. And from that point, that's been the one focus of our lives. And we are thankful for the privilege. I trust that I can make clear to you what's happened. First of all, notice that Kenya is a small country, relatively speaking, that's a little bit bigger than Texas, and yet we have 45 million people. And I've often made the point we have 45 million people and 35 million registered cell phones. So don't think of it as a land of savages. This is a land that is rapidly modernizing. But Kenya is the shape of a keystone. And in many ways, Kenya is the keystone to the future of Africa. Nairobi is a huge metropolis. Nairobi, when I first knew it in 1956, had about 250,000 people. A lovely city, almost on the equator, a mile high. Climate is glorious, unless you stand in the sun, and then it'll burn you up very quickly. But in the shade, it is beautiful. Average temperature year-round is about 68 degrees. Never colder than 50 or higher than 90. So, of course, it's great. It's a nice climate. But now it has grown from 250,000 within the city limits to 3.5 million. But the metropolis is 8 to 10 million in that area. And that's where God has placed us. It is sometimes called the capital of Africa. Now, Africa is not a country. It's a continent. It's 52 separate nations, over 1,500 different languages, mutually incomprehensible. In Kenya alone, we have fewer than some of the nations, but we have 44 officially recognized languages, plus English and Swahili, that are the two official languages of the nation. It's a country that is important for the future of Africa, if Africa is to have any kind of future at all. And that's why God has put us there. We started in South Africa, and then we can look at that. But look at the location of Kenya as the keystone. On the Indian Ocean, it's a developing nation. It's also listed in Transparency International as one of the 10 most corrupt nations in the world. It's growing at 5% a year economically. And yet the World Bank says if corruption could be checked, its real growth is 9 to 10% a year. That's an incredible growth rate. And it is the key to the future. This is where we started, not in that. That wasn't our house. But we started in Zululand. Zululand, South Africa, is a hilly country, generally green and fertile, though it looks very barren here, and it is in that particular section. But we started in an Africa that was traditional. That's the Africa that you read about and that you think is still the Africa today. It is not. We think of Africa like this. That's okay for the movies, but that's not where it is today. The only time you can see that kind of dress is when they're putting on a special occasion, or particularly when the tourists come, they put on the costumes because it's a good way to earn money. People will leave a tip, and that's what they interpret as Africa today. It is not Africa today at all. This is the Africa that we knew, 65 years ago. That's the Africa we came to. and the first language we learned was Zulu. By the way, as I told the young people, you all have to learn Zulu, by the way, if you want to go to heaven, because Zulu is the language of heaven, and the Amazulu are the people of heaven. Literally, the name isiZulu means the language of heaven. Zulu is heaven. So the people were not particularly heavenly, but they were there, and they were receptive to the teaching of the gospel. But these are pictures that of the Africa that we knew 65 years ago. This is actually a Sunday school that we started through the teachers we were training at the Teacher Training College, and that was 65 years ago. Africa has changed and is still changing. The gospel's been proclaimed all over most of Africa, but not all. And yet evangelism is not the end of the Great Commission. We are to go into all the world and preach the gospel, yes, but what's the rest of it say? Making disciples of every nation, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded. We have evangelized and neglected disciple making, and that's been our particular call, that we would stress disciple making. One of my students at the seminary some years ago looked at what we had done, and he tried to make an estimate of how many people we had evangelized and come to Christ, and he named some very high figure. And I thought, but the real point is, have we left people behind who can take the next generation and the next generation? That is the real payoff. So there has been a response. This is the baptismal at a church we were working with in Johannesburg. No baptistry inside, but a baptistry outside. And there were churches that grew, African churches that grew and developed. And it looks Christian when you drive through. When you look at census figures, it looks Christian. But they go to church on Sunday. 40% of Kenya will be in church on any given Sunday. 80% say they're Christian, which merely means they're not Muslim and they're not traditional. And it doesn't mean anything, because Monday morning you have to pay a bribe if you want to see a government officer. You have to pay a bribe if you mistakenly turn from the wrong lane and you don't want to go to court. Everywhere we go, people have no apparent realization of a real Christian life. And that is a deep heartache, and it is ravaging the continent. We began with some of our students that we trained in writing and editing. We began the Our Africa magazine in Johannesburg. That magazine was a popular magazine covering current affairs, sports, politics a bit, but little, because that's an explosive subject in Africa, but not too much, but enough for them to get an idea of what a Christian worldview was like. And music, and every issue had a Bible lesson and one or more invitations to receive Christ. Our Africa became the fourth largest magazine in all of Africa, and in the years of its circulation. It only lasted 5 years. It had to be closed because of the difficulties of the apartheid regime in South Africa. It circulated in an area twice the size of the United States, and that still didn't cover all of Africa. But in that magazine, there were many who came to Christ, many who went to Bible school. For some years, when I traveled in other parts of Africa, I'd go to the Bible school, the pastoral training schools, and be introduced as the former publisher of Our Africa. And I would find in every Bible school in about 12 different nations, they would say, I'm here because I came to Christ through Our Africa magazine. And it was 1, 2, 3, sometimes 10 or 12. And I was grateful for that evidence of God's blessing. That magazine was from 1958 to 1963. Are you able to read that caption? is it too small? Oh, good. I was afraid to make too big a caption, but take up too much space, but I hope it's there because we have more reading to do as I try to go through this. When we closed the magazine, when it had to close, missions and churches in Africa and South Asia invited our staff to come and help them with their Christian literature ministries. But they could not go because under South Africa's apartheid regime, it was impossible for them to get passports to travel. But we could travel and we could go. And so we responded to an invitation from southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, to go there and start a second publishing house, which we did. And that was Daystar Publications. We published materials for the church's National Literacy Project, Bible stories, other materials, simple materials for reading. We published the literacy materials in Shona, Sindebele, and English. And through that National Literacy Project, it is estimated that the literacy in what is now Zimbabwe increased from 20% to about 60%. And we were thankful that we had a part in that as well. So from that grew Daystar Communications. Daystar Publications continued. Our colleague, an African man who later became a member of parliament in South Africa, took the publishing part to Zambia, Lusaka, Zambia. Now when I talk about these names, you think, well, they were just little areas like Newport's here and Portland is there and that. No, the area we were talking about is larger than the United States. And so it covered a lot of people. Our work came to concentrate on training. These 5 men were from 3 different countries. They came voluntarily to our home and lived with us for a time so that we could not only disciple them but teach them how to edit and how to work with Christian literature. That's fantastic that we had those privileges over and over again. We had this, our home came to be called Uplift Study Center. And people came and lived with us, and we talked with them, discipled with them. And out of that grew the development of music and Christian literature, teaching materials. My wife's primary focus is on music, and that's been her training and her background. She started this group of women, Bulawayo Christian singers. Every year they would go to hospitals, they'd go to institutions and sing at special times, gave programs sometimes in clubs, sometimes in churches. And it was a great ministry all by itself, but we did that sort of as a sideline. And together that gave the foundation for growth in other areas as well. During those years, I was asked to develop something similar to the Living Bible in African languages, a teaching version of Scripture in popular language. I trained and guided about 45 translation teams across Africa and in India and also in East Asia. The bookstore there in that picture illustrates the many places where their work was distributed. That was a Christian bookstore in Sri Lanka, which was one of the areas where we trained the translation teams. Guerrilla warfare broke out in 1965. I remember it very well because our daughter was born 2 weeks after the warfare started, after the country of southern Rhodesia became Rhodesia, a rebel nation. 5% of the population were white, and they wanted to maintain control over the whole country always. And, well, it's a good way to start a war. If you try to control something that isn't your place and your home. And that war did start. It escalated, and students had great difficulty coming to us as they were coming before. Only 2 nations recognized the existence of the nation of Rhodesia. And as a result, we had a lot of difficulty. We were cut off from postal services. This is before the days of email and all of that. We were cut off from any prepared foods. Gasoline was very scarce. All of it was imported illegally and very strictly rationed. Banking services were closed down internationally. For many months, we received no support, not because you or other churches stopped, but it couldn't get to us. And so we found that that time, however, brought us closer to the people than almost anything else could, because we were more dependent upon them than we realized. We had enough land, so we had a garden. We had some fruit, so we had food, but we didn't have any staple food or no meat. So one Christian man had a large ranch. He said, "You can hunt on my ranch. I don't allow hunting there, but you can hunt there for your meat." So I did. I loved the hunting. I didn't like the killing and the butchering, but we had meat. And then others brought us maize meal, cornmeal, in large sacks. That's the staple food in that area. Others brought peanuts to us that they had grown. So we never missed a meal. We never missed a rent payment. I don't know how the money came, but somehow we had the money every month to pay the rent. And we saw God work to supply in ways that we still don't understand. But the closeness that came is really the foundation of much of our subsequent work. In 1972, we were still in Rhodesia, isolated behind the blockade. I was Africa Director for Living Bibles International and their International Research Director, and I had to travel. But I had to go by ground to Johannesburg, which was 500 miles away, before I could get on a plane that would take me to the other parts where I had to do the training work. It was a difficult time, but yet we kept on, and we had much to rejoice in the people who came to know Christ. We started a church in our home with about 8 in a women's group that my wife led in the Sindebele language. But it kept growing, and finally the women said, "What about our men?" So we said, "Well, what about them?" "Well, we want them too." So we agreed once a month to have a Sunday afternoon meeting. Within about 3 months, it was every Sunday. And we ended up with a church of between 100 and 150 in our home. Well, it wasn't inside. It was fortunately outside and in the garden and so on. And I was so thrilled when I saw my son, who at that time was about 8 or 9 years old. He had gathered the children around himself, and he was teaching them the lesson for the day. And he knew the lesson from the teachers, and he knew the language, and so he shared the word with them. We were thankful for that. Now, Dr. Taylor, who did Living Bible originally, the paraphrase of Scripture, is from Oregon, from Beaverton. He graduated from Beaverton High, and his wife from Tigard. We knew him well and appreciated him very much. He said to me one time at a meeting, "What will it take to move you out of Rhodesia so that other people can come to you?" We considered that and prayed about it. We knew how much it would take. And I told him the figure. I said $50,000. "Oh, thank you." That was at breakfast. But then after breakfast, I said, "Ken, I'm sorry, but the Lord's spoken to me about this. I didn't tell you the accurate figure. It really will be $100,000 for the shipping of the files, the library, the materials used, all of the process of getting there, finding property in Nairobi. The move was expensive, and it was across closed borders. It was a difficult time. But Ken came back to me at lunchtime and said, "You have the money. All of the foundation, Tyndale Foundation members are here at this conference, and I've talked to them, and they agreed unanimously to give you the money." $100,000 in 1972 is like about $1 million today. And that enabled us to move to Nairobi in 1972. And that original campus that we bought in 72, small piece of ground, about 1.5 acres, and a house and facilities that Shell Oil had developed for a training center. We could move in and continue the training work immediately. Now, it kept growing, and from that center, over the next few years, we directed or worked with over 75 different evaluative studies and research of churches and missions in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And that is where Daystar University got its beginning. We today have a Master of Arts in Communication. That came in 1976 in cooperation with Wheaton College, because we were not allowed to have a private university under the laws of those days. But we could work with an American university. So students gained a graduate degree without ever coming to America, totally for work done there. But the diploma said Wheaton College and Daystar Communications at that time gave that degree in '76. And then it kept growing, so that the U.S. in 1976 said you must establish an African Asian board. We did, and then it kept on growing even more. A diploma for the first 2 years of a bachelor's degree began in 1976 as well. And then the final BA began in 1984. 1984, in cooperation with Messiah College of Pennsylvania. And so it went on, kept growing between 1984 and I can't remember the dates, so if you can read them, you can fill me in. I've forgotten. Too many things have happened. But it kept growing, so that we kept praying then they need to have an African executive director. It wasn't our intention ever to start something and keep control of it. We were not trying to build an empire, a work for ourselves to lead. We were trying to start the church that would be truly indigenous and strengthen it. And Daystar University was only a tool toward that end. Today, the university kept growing and keeps on growing. In 1977, we began looking seriously for an African to take charge. We finally found the man in 1979, a professor at the University of Nairobi, and he took over the work, but they asked us to stay until 1981 to help in the transition. We then came back to Western Seminary. At Western Seminary had asked us to head the missions program, and my wife became international coordinator of the 6 campuses of Western. I became chair of the division of missions there. But travel continued and accelerated. Daystar, in the 30 years we were based in Portland, Daystar alone asked us to come back 35 times to teach and to guide and to help. So we never really left. So we're back where we're very, very comfortable. Mostly, not always. And Western, meanwhile, developed a strong missions program, and we were delighted to see that in its site on Hawthorne near Mount Tabor in Portland. But then we were invited back because we were asked to work in South Sudan because there were a lot of problems there. The communists had taken over the major Christian radio station in Africa, based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And so the people who had that station said, well, how can we repeat this? How can we carry on the work effectively? Our radio station is gone. So they said, take 3 different language groups across Africa, find out what would be the most effective way to reach them. The Lutheran World Federation funded that program for 5 years, and I worked in and out of South Sudan. Every vacation at Western, I was in South Sudan and working with the people there. And during that period, I would just say, summing it up, when we started, there were no known churches among the 12 tribes of Equatoria Province, east bank of the Nile. When we finished 5 years later, there were churches in 10 of the 12 tribes. So that was one effect of that period of work. It's a rugged country in terrible situation today. The poverty, the hunger is even worse today than then because of the independence granted. The president and vice president broke out in a deadly quarrel that's tearing the country apart. They are potentially a wealthy country. Oil fields are rich. They have iron, they have gold, they have titanium, they have you name it, and they've got it. But they're so greedy that the two leaders from separate tribes have went to war, and everything is upset and killing. One of the men we've trained in mission at Daystar has gone back to South Sudan, his home, and he can't bring his wife there, she's Kenyan, because it's too dangerous. People are being killed everywhere in the country. Please pray for South Sudan. These people have heard now. They didn't before, but now they have, and they have not responded in obedience to Christ. In that project, we tried to deal with hunger by teaching these tribes in eastern Equatoria plowing with their oxen. They love their cattle, but they'd never used them to plow. So we taught them that. And they now plow, and we've taken part in their tribal ceremonies so that they accepted our workers and my colleague, who is Swedish, and myself as people that they would trust. And we took part in these various things. That led us then to respond to a need for help from the Middle East, from the Arab World Evangelical Ministries Association, an Egyptian Christian mission that has 75 missionaries. They're in all 22 of the Arab League nations. Working with them, we started the Augustine Theological Institute. Now we taught on Malta for several years. People could come from there with a simple process from North Africa because we couldn't train the people we were training. They were Muslim converts, house church leaders. It was against the law two ways. You can't teach a Muslim the Christian scriptures according to the laws of most of those countries. Secondly, they couldn't have churches, so they just have meetings in the home. And as a result, the gospel is spreading. We teach just 15 in a 2-year program. 6 months in residence at Daystar, the rest in the field, where with the WEMA we follow them up in those closed countries. We love the ministry. It's a tremendous privilege to work with them. These are people, 2 Chinese, 2 Americans, 1 Ghanaian, that I had the privilege of training at Western Seminary. One's in Burma, another one is back in Ghana, which also has about 15 unreached people groups. The other Chinese person is working in mainland China and among the minority Chinese people. And the man on the right is in Brazil. So we've had the privilege of working with students and leaders from about 115 nations through the years. The leader of the Baptist churches in Northeast India, which is an unusual phenomenon. In Northeast India, about 90% of the people are Christians, and almost all of them are Baptist. But some of them are Christians anyway. Well, I say that because among one tribe, one of the leaders was a contractor, and he built roads. The central government of India said, we'd like you to build roads in that country. And he said, well, I'll do it, but I have to be paid in advance because of the equipment and so on. He carefully tithed that money to the church, but he never built the roads. He kept the money. So that's what I mean about, yeah, he was a Baptist church member. You see what I mean about discipleship? We could give many examples. This lady in the middle is the wife of a man who did his doctorate with us at Western, and he became the leader of the Baptist churches in Northeast India. We were out in the city of Shillong in Northeast, and just walking along, so we sat to rest. While we were resting, his wife began talking to these 2 ladies, And she was telling them and sharing with them about Jesus, just automatically as we go in ordinary walk. That's what the Great Commission talks about. As you are going, proclaim the gospel and make disciples. And she did that, and we praise God for their lives and the effectiveness of them, that they share Jesus wherever they go. So that there's so much that you have accomplished in this church through your work and mission. For since 1994, we had Worldview Center in Portland. We were able to purchase this building, renovate the building through the help of many Christian people. I think there were one or two carpenters from Newport that came up to help us. And some from Portland, some from Eugene. And we renovated that building, and we had over 300 international students go through there for further training while they were at Western Seminary. The Worldview Center, literally, those 300 are all around the world. They're everywhere. And they're reaching the multitudes that we can't directly reach ourselves. They have sold Worldview Center after my wife and I left. They had their reasons. I was disappointed to see it stopped, but we praise God for the 300 that were prepared and the work that was done in that period. During these years, it's not only in churches, but the Centers for Disease Control of the U.S. government called on me to give training in intercultural communication. How do you get along with people from a different culture? How can you teach them better health habits? I had the privilege of working at the Centers for Disease Control in intensive workshops in Morgantown, West Virginia, and Cincinnati, Ohio. And through that, I was able to lead at least one of the researchers, he was the deputy director, to Christ, and then his wife to the Lord, while I was doing the workshop, apparently to help doctors and nurses do a better job with health. Of course, our own well-being depends heavily upon the work that CDC does in the U.S. We've worked in Japan and had the privilege of training people there and spending time with them and in their homes. And also we've worked in, went to a conference in Tokyo in 2010 where 3,000 third world missionaries met together to chart and discover the next way forward. Do you realize that today there are more missionaries from Africa alone than there are from all of Europe and North America? And that's not even including the Asian missionaries, which they have a higher number than Africa. So working with third world missions is critical if we're going to have a church that will change the world. So step by step, we do these things. France, we hear about a lot of all the immigrants coming in, particularly how they're flooding in across the Mediterranean. We've been there with our staff, ourselves. I've spent time there too, training immigrant groups to reach other immigrants. The largest churches in Paris today are immigrant churches led by Christians from Peru or Bolivia or Ghana or Nigeria. The largest church in England today is a Nigerian pastor. We have a very different world than the one I grew up in and the one that was here. And we need to take advantage of those things. The Peruvian mission is called NUMA, the New World Mission Organization. And they too have, that one group has over 1,000 missionaries from Peru to Europe and Africa. And it's a different world. We thank God for it. Now I'm getting close to the end, but I do want to share with you a little bit more about Kenya. These are Maasai women. The Maasai are one group out of the 44 in Kenya that have retained their customs even while coming to Christ. And some of the strong leaders we have in Kenya of the church are now Maasai. But when I first went to Kenya to live with my wife and family in the 1970s, there were only about a dozen known Christians among the Maasai. Today, the tribe is predominantly Christian. God has been doing a lot of things because of your faithfulness in praying. Kenya is a potentially rich country. These tea plantations make it the fourth largest producer of tea in the world. And it's not only tea, but the agriculture is the backbone of their economy and of their life. But only 18% of the land is arable. Much of it is desert or near desert. But that's not really the place where Africa is today. This is where Africa is today. That's Nairobi, city center. And there are two other centers to Nairobi that are almost as big as this one. You just can't get a high point to get a picture of them. I could for this one. It was visible. And Nairobi, as I said, is in the urban area between 8 and 10 million people. Traffic is horrendous. Our standing joke is that traffic is so packed, and so even though we have 4 and 6 lane highways, it takes us 2 hours to get from our campus 25 miles outside Nairobi into the city center. And pedestrians give up waiting for the traffic to stop. They just run between the cars. And if you don't get there, well, you don't run. You're dead. Tragically, I've seen people killed while I watched as they were trying to get through the traffic. We joke about it a little bit. That's why Kenya produces so many Olympic-level runners. If you don't run, you're dead. It's simple. But it's a different world. The Nairobi Symphony is a very, very fine symphony. They usually bring in a guest conductor, but 3/4 of those people are Kenyans who have learned and have been trained. Up in the top row, there are 3 men, if you look carefully. The one on the right is our son-in-law, Bill Rowe. Julissa, our daughter, was here a couple of years ago, I think it was right. And Bill is a very, very fine trumpeter. They say in the programs that he's the best trumpeter in East Africa's 8 nations. That may be true. But regardless of that, it gives him a tremendous in to talk with these people about the Lord. And they know that they can trust him. When 2 young people from the slum were given a music scholarship by the government, they chose Bill to accompany them to New York and back because they knew they could trust him. So he has a witness in very unusual places. We just went through the elections of 2017, which were later nullified because of irregularities and illegalities. The first time in any African nation's history that the Supreme Court was able to nullify the elections when they've been rigged. Certainly not the only time the elections have been rigged. They've been rigged routinely. But this time, a Christian Chief Justice said enough. And we have a rerun on the 17th of October, a month from today. Pray for it, because they have never had a peaceful election in Nairobi. Since 1963, every election has had violence. And in 2007 and 8, they had killed about 1,500 people, and over 500,000 were displaced internally. Pray that that doesn't happen again. Chances are that humanly it will, because even though, as this lady said very poignantly, all I want is a peaceful 2017. The elections in August were not totally peaceful, but they were better than usual. But the president has now said, I don't accept what the Supreme Court said. First day he said he did. The next day, when there were no reporters around, he did not accept it. He said, when I'm re-elected, you are the Supreme Court. I'll listen to the will of the people. I'm going to get rid of those fools and crooks and robbers that took the election from me from the Supreme Court. Yet he had appointed the Chief Justice and asked him to enforce the law. The Chief Justice is the uncle of our student body president at Daystar, and he did enforce the law, but the end is not known yet. Pray for them. Everybody has an answer. This drawing by Escher, a Dutch artist, beautifully portrays the tragedy of relativism today in the world. Everybody has an answer, but they go nowhere. They don't really have an answer for the problems. What will change things in Kenya? We don't want to just listen to everybody's answer, but that's why we're there as Daystar. We have the opportunity at Daystar to change the leadership slowly. But I remember what one cabinet minister said. I've had the privilege of working with Samuel Pugisio, a Daystar graduate. He was Minister of Communications. He said, I've had a privilege of working with him and with other Daystar graduates, and they are a cut above all others I have worked with. Now that's his direct words. And that's what we try to do at Daystar. We are trying to train people who will make a difference and will change the tragedies that bedevil Africa. This young man lived with us for 4 years. He became a very, very effective street preacher. Probably, I don't know, 5,000-10,000 people came to Christ over the 40 years he preached on the streets. He's basically retired. His voice has failed for street preaching. So now he's limited to just churches and his correspondence course, following up on the people that he brought to the Lord in the church, in the streets. He's Stephen, his name you remember, Karanja. And we are delighted that he's not alone. There are others like this. And that's why it's so worthwhile. And we were so thankful to go back to Daystar. Daystar's motto is excellence, transformation, servant leadership. This man was elected 2 years in a row to be student president. Under him, discipline rose in the work. He was chosen nationally as the outstanding student leader of the last year, and he received that last award that came in there. These are some of the people at Daystar we're working with. The couple at the bottom want to go to the mountains of Nubia in North Sudan. Isolated, heavy persecution. Islam is trying to wipe out the church there, and they want to go there and help that struggling church in Nubia. I could tell you of each of them, but they're people we love. There are people that you have been able to be a part of in reaching the gospel. This young woman is Congolese, one of 25 other nations in the student body. This is the group from, actually they're from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, and Sudan. This is the Augustine Theological Institute on our back patio at the house we have on the middle of the campus of Daystar's undergraduate school. We are grateful, and I wanted to share with you exactly what's happened, and then what next. After all, isn't it about time for us to retire? We have no plan to retire. I'm 88. My wife will be 89. She's much older than I am. She's 7 months older. But she has just finished with a team helping her, writing the story of the beginnings of Daystar and how God has worked and provided. It's called Daystar Rising. I do the final edit, and it'll be available by mid-year, Lord willing. I'm also bringing out the second edition of this book on Christian communication that has been used in several universities in America as well as in Africa. I have the first draft finished, but I need to do some further work on it, and it too is due for mid next year. That's a large part of our work now. What next? Writing and publishing. And I would say the student counseling. These are some of the titles we're working on. We have the draft ready. We have weekly Bible studies in our home, 6 every week, on Romans, on John, on servant leadership, Christian leadership, forming a Christian worldview. We will concentrate on that. We need work in video. There's an unusual opportunity there. We have 15 TV channels in Nairobi, and of those 15 channels, they'll all accept Christian material, not televangelists. They will not. But they will accept drama that stresses the truth of the gospel, the story of Christ. And that's where our daughter is particularly working in helping to train and develop Christian production groups. And that's one of the next things we need to work on. African culture is very, very open to drama and to music. Those are their primary ways to communicate. rather than talking. And storytelling, they love to hear the stories of Scripture. And that's the area particularly that Julissa and Bill and others from Daystar are focusing on. Well, there's so many other things we could share. After all, how do I talk about 65 years and let you know how you've been a part of that for nearly 60 years? We like to use the giraffe as our icon because we said, first as a joke, we're always sticking our necks out and taking risks. But and we thought, oh, the giraffe, it's got a long neck. Then we learned that the giraffe also is very far-sighted. Its eyes are so constructed by our Lord that they're like telescopes. They can see accurately at a distance. Other animals graze around them, and if a giraffe begins to run, they all run because the watchman has told them it's time to run. We want to be like that in the church and for the Lord's sake, to be watchmen. Christianity does not mean knowing about Jesus. If you know about Jesus, that's good. That's just the beginning. It means knowing him. It does not mean arguing about him. When we witness by arguing, we're defeating ourselves. It means meeting him. It means the certainty of experience that Jesus is alive. It means loving him. And that's what our work is, wherever we are. And I thank you so more than words can tell at what you've done and made it possible for us to do with you. Thank you.